Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave, shovel by shovel, entirely blinded by their own arrogance? Picture a crisp autumn afternoon in an affluent neighborhood. A hard-working, black, single mother is simply standing on a public sidewalk, waiting for her 8-year-old son to finish school. Enter 2 police officers with a massive chip on their shoulder and a desperate need to exert authority. They thought she was an easy target. They thought they could slap handcuffs on her for loitering and call it a victorious day. But they picked the absolute wrong woman. By the time they realized her true identity, their careers, their freedom, and their entire lives would be burned to the ground. Stick around, because the karma in this story is absolutely glorious. The neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights was the kind of place where the manicured lawns looked as though they were trimmed with nail scissors, and the streets were lined with imported luxury sedans. It was a picturesque, deeply exclusive enclave that prided itself on its quiet, orderly existence. For 34-year-old Maya Caldwell, it was simply the place where her son went to school. Maya was a single mother who had spent the last decade working her way up from absolutely nothing. She was dressed in a simple, understated navy trench coat, dark jeans, and sensible loafers. Her 8-year-old son, Jackson, had recently earned a highly coveted academic scholarship to the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. Jackson was a brilliant, quiet boy who loved robotics and dinosaurs, and Maya was determined to give him every opportunity she never had. It was Tuesday afternoon, 3:15 p.m. Maya stood near a wrought-iron bench on the public sidewalk, just outside the academy's imposing stone gates. She was early. Jackson's Advanced Science Club didn't let out until 3:30 p.m. Her car, a modest 10-year-old Honda sedan, was parked legally along the street a few yards away. She held a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, enjoying the crisp autumn air, mentally preparing for the evening routine of dinner, homework, and bedtime. A few blocks down, a black and white patrol cruiser turned the corner. Behind the wheel was Officer Derek Callahan, a 15-year veteran of the force whose reputation preceded him. Callahan was notoriously heavy-handed, a man who viewed his badge not as a shield for the community, but as a blunt instrument of absolute authority. Beside him sat Officer Toby Hendricks, a fresh-faced rookie barely 6 months out of the academy, who was still trying to figure out how to navigate the complex realities of street policing and how to survive his overbearing training officer. "Check this out," Callahan muttered, his eyes zeroing in on Maya. He tapped the steering wheel with thick, calloused fingers. "What do we have here?" Hendricks squinted through the windshield. "Looks like a woman waiting for someone. School gets out soon. Not around here. She doesn't—" Callahan scoffed, his tone dripping with immediate, unwarranted suspicion. "She doesn't fit the Oak Ridge profile. Toby, look at the car she's parked near. Look at her. People who live here don't just stand around on the sidewalk. They have places to be. She's casing the neighborhood, or she's loitering. Callahan, she's literally just standing by a bench," Hendricks offered, his voice laced with hesitation. "There's no crime in standing. Watch and learn, kid," Callahan replied, ignoring the rookie's entirely rational observation. He hit the flashing lights, not the sirens, just the bright, blinding red and blues, and pulled the cruiser abruptly to the curb, tires scraping against the concrete just inches from where Maya was standing. Maya didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her dark eyes locking onto the cruiser. Having grown up in a neighborhood where the police were often more of a hazard than a help, she knew the drill. She squared her shoulders, keeping her hands entirely visible, resting them lightly on the top of her coffee cup. Callahan stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt in a classic display of intimidation. He puffed out his chest, adopting a wide stance as he approached her. Hendricks trailed a few steps behind, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Afternoon," Callahan said, though the word sounded more like a challenge than a greeting. "What exactly are you doing out here?" "Good afternoon, officer," Maya replied. Her voice was calm, measured, and perfectly articulate. "I'm waiting for my son. He finishes his science club at the academy in about 10 minutes. Callahan looked her up and down, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He glanced at the imposing gates of Oak Ridge Prep, then back to Maya. "Your son goes to Oak Ridge." "That is correct," Maya said smoothly. She didn't offer any further explanation. She didn't owe him her life story, nor did she need to justify her son's scholarship. "Right," Callahan said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "And I'm the mayor of this city. Look, Ma'am, we've had reports of package thefts and suspicious activity in this area. We can't just have people loitering on the sidewalks." "I am not loitering, officer," Maya corrected him, her tone remaining impeccably polite but firm. "Loitering requires remaining in an area for no obvious reason, often with the intent to commit a crime. I have a very obvious reason for being here. I'm a mother waiting to pick up her child from school. Furthermore, I'm standing on a public right-of-way." Callahan's eyes narrowed. He was not used to being spoken to with such calm authority, especially not by someone he had already mentally categorized as a subordinate. The fact that she was citing the legal definition of loitering irritated him immensely. It bruised his fragile ego. "I didn't ask for a law lesson," Callahan snapped, stepping closer, invading her personal space. "I asked what you're doing here, and now I'm asking for your ID. Hand it over, now." Maya held her ground. She did not step back, nor did she reach into her pockets. "Am I suspected of committing a crime?" "Officer, I said, give me your ID." Callahan barked, his face flushing red. "In this state," Maya continued, her voice projecting slightly, so that the rookie, Hendricks, could hear her clearly. "A police officer cannot demand identification from a pedestrian unless there is reasonable, articulable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. Since waiting for a child on a public sidewalk is not a crime, I respectfully decline your request to search my belongings for my identification." Hendricks shifted his weight nervously. Derek, maybe we should just let her." "Shut up, Toby Callahan." Callahan roared, cutting his partner off. He turned his full, glaring attention back to Maya. The air between them grew thick with tension. Callahan had drawn a line in the sand, and his pride would not allow him to walk back from it. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, entirely due to Callahan's inability to de-escalate his own ego. The noise of the confrontation had begun to attract the attention of the surrounding neighborhood. A woman jogging by with a golden retriever slowed her pace, her eyes darting between Maya and the police officers. Across the street, a resident named Brenda Carmichael, a woman notorious on the local neighborhood app for reporting suspicious delivery drivers, stepped out onto her porch, arms crossed, watching with a look of smug satisfaction. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Callahan sneered, taking another step forward until he was mere inches from Maya. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and strong peppermint gum wafted off him. "You think you can come into this neighborhood, spout some legal mumbo-jumbo, and disrespect a sworn officer? I have shown you nothing but respect. Officer, Maya replied, her voice remaining eerily composed. It was the calmness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I am simply exercising my constitutional rights. I suggest you consult your partner, or perhaps your shift supervisor, before you do something that you will deeply regret. That was the trigger. To Callahan, being warned by a civilian, a black woman standing next to a beat-up Honda in a wealthy neighborhood, was an unforgivable insult. "I'm giving you one lawful order to disperse," Callahan growled, pointing a thick finger down the street. "You get in that piece of trash car and you leave, or you're going to be arrested for loitering, failure to comply, and resisting arrest." Maya looked at him, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, intense sharpness. "If I leave, my 8-year-old son will walk out of those gates in exactly 7 minutes, and his mother will not be here. He will be terrified. I am not going anywhere." "You brought this on yourself," Callahan said. Without another word, Callahan lunged forward. He grabbed Maya's right arm, his grip brutal and unnecessarily rough. Maya's coffee cup slipped from her grasp, tumbling to the concrete and shattering, hot liquid splashing across the pristine sidewalk and the cuffs of her jeans. "Hey, let go of me!" Maya shouted, her calm finally breaking, replaced by genuine alarm at the physical assault. "Stop resisting, stop resisting," Callahan began yelling, deploying the standard verbal defense used by officers trying to justify physical force to bystanders. "She wasn't doing anything," a voice rang out. It was a younger man, a high school student in a track uniform who had stopped on the corner, pulling out his smartphone and hitting record. She was just standing there. "Back off." "Kid, this is police business," Callahan yelled over his shoulder. He twisted Maya's arm behind her back, forcing her to bend awkwardly. Officer Hendricks finally moved forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Derek. Man, ease up, we don't need to do this. We don't have cause." I said back off, Toby secure the perimeter. Callahan ordered, his face entirely red, sweat beading on his forehead. From across the street, Brenda Carmichael cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "Good job! Officers keep our streets safe from these people." Maya gasped in pain as Callahan wrenched her shoulder upward. "Officer, you are hyperextending my rotator cuff. I am complying. I am not resisting. You are assaulting me." "You're under arrest," Callahan hissed in her ear. He unclipped the metal handcuffs from his belt. The heavy steel clicked as he ratcheted the cold metal around her right wrist, tightening it far past the point of necessity. It bit sharply into her skin, instantly restricting the blood flow. "Derek, wait," Hendricks pleaded, grabbing Callahan's shoulder. "Think about this. She hasn't done anything. If we arrest her, what's the charge? We can't articulate a charge." Callahan shoved Hendricks's hand away violently. "I said loitering. I said failure to comply. I'll think of the rest when we get to the station. Now help me cuff her left hand, or I'm writing you up for insubordination." Reluctantly, looking physically sick to his stomach, the young rookie stepped forward. Maya locked eyes with Hendricks. She didn't plead with him. She simply looked at him with a profound, piercing disappointment that seemed to freeze the young man in his tracks. "You don't have to follow an unlawful order," Maya told Hendricks softly. "You know this is wrong." Hendricks hesitated, his hands trembling, but the fear of his training officer won out over his conscience. He gently took Maya's left arm and brought it behind her back, allowing Callahan to snap the second cuff into place. "There," Callahan breathed heavily, stepping back to admire his handiwork. Maya stood handcuffed on the sidewalk, her coffee spilled, her dignity assaulted. "Now, let's see how smart you are in a holding cell." just as Callahan grabbed her by the bicep to march her toward the cruiser. The heavy oak doors of the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy swung open. A stream of children in neat uniforms began pouring out, chatting and laughing. Among them was Jackson. He was wearing his little green blazer, his backpack slung over one shoulder, holding a small robotic arm he had built in class. He looked up, scanning the sidewalk for his mother. His eyes landed on Maya. He saw the flashing lights of the police car. He saw the two large men standing over her. He saw the silver handcuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. The robotic arm slipped from Jackson's hands, crashing onto the pavement and breaking into pieces. "Mom," Jackson's voice was small, terrified, cutting through the noise of the street like a knife. He started to run toward her. "Mom, Jackson, stay there," Maya shouted, her voice laced with maternal panic. She struggled against Callahan's grip, trying to turn her body to shield her son from the trauma of the moment. "Don't come closer, baby, it's okay." Mr. Harrison, the science teacher, had seen the commotion and immediately jogged over, intercepting Jackson and holding the crying boy back. The teacher looked at the officers in absolute shock. "Officers, what on earth is going on here?" "Mister!" Harrison demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "This is Mrs. Caldwell. She's one of our parents. Her son is right here." Callahan sneered, dismissing the teacher entirely. "Take the kid inside. His mother is under arrest." "For what?" Mr. Harrison yelled. Jackson was sobbing hysterically now, burying his face in the teacher's coat. Maya fought to keep her tears at bay. She had to be strong. "Mr. Harrison, please, take him inside. Call my brother, David. His number is in Jackson's emergency contacts. Tell him to meet me at the precinct." "I've got him. Maya, I've got him," Mr. Harrison promised. Kneeling down to comfort the devastated child, Callahan shoved Maya roughly toward the back of the cruiser. "Move it! You're causing a public disturbance." "You are the public disturbance," Maya shot back, her voice suddenly dropping an octave, radiating a cold, lethal fury. "Remember everything you have done today, Officer Callahan. Remember every single word, because you are going to be repeating them under oath." Callahan laughed a harsh, ugly sound. He placed a hand on the top of her head and aggressively pushed her down into the back seat of the patrol car, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. The interior of the car smelled of old vinyl, sweat, and despair. Maya sat awkwardly, the handcuffs digging painfully into her wrists, her shoulder burning from the rough treatment. Hendricks climbed into the passenger seat, refusing to look back at her. Callahan got behind the wheel, turning off the flashing lights, and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a sobbing child, a stunned teacher, and a neighborhood buzzing with gossip. The drive to the 4th precinct took about 15 minutes. For the first 10, Callahan gloated. "You see, people like you think the rules don't apply to you," Callahan monologued, staring at Maya in the rearview mirror. "You think you can come into a nice neighborhood, run your mouth, and get away with it. Well, welcome to the real world. In the real world, I wear the badge, and I make the rules. You're going to be sitting in a cell all night. Let's see if Child Protective Services thinks you're fit to raise a kid after this." Maya didn't say a word. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began mentally compiling a list. She noted the lack of probable cause. She noted the excessive force. She noted the threat regarding CPS, which constituted coercion and severe professional misconduct. Every word out of his mouth was just another nail in his coffin. When they arrived at the 4th precinct, Callahan dragged her out of the car and marched her through the double-glass doors into the main booking area, The precinct was busy, phones were ringing, officers were typing up reports, and a few minor offenders were sitting handcuffed to a long wooden bench. Behind the high booking desk sat Sergeant Tom Miller, a grey-haired veteran who was 3 weeks away from retirement. He was shuffling through some paperwork when Callahan approached, practically parading Maya like a hunting trophy. "Hey, Sarge," Callahan said loudly, ensuring the room heard him. "Got a live one here. Loitering. Failure to comply with a lawful order, resisting arrest, and causing a public disturbance." Sergeant Miller looked up over his reading glasses. He looked at Callahan, then his eyes drifted to Maya. Miller froze. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took off his glasses, his hands visibly shaking. "Callahan," Miller breathed out, his voice barely a whisper. "What? What did you do?" "I brought in a perp. Sarge. Needs processing." Callahan replied, oblivious to the atmosphere in the room rapidly shifting. Hendricks, standing behind Callahan, noticed Miller's reaction and finally felt the true, icy grip of terror settle in his stomach. Suddenly, the door to the precinct captain's office burst open. Captain Greg Henderson, the commanding officer of the 4th Precinct, marched out. He had a file in his hand and was barking an order to a detective when his eyes swept across the booking area. Captain Henderson stopped dead in his tracks. The file slipped from his hand, scattering papers across the tiled floor. "Good Lord," Henderson gasped. He didn't walk. He sprinted across the booking area, shoving Callahan out of the way so violently that the larger officer stumbled backward. "Captain, what the hell, Tish?" Callahan started. "Shut your mouth," Henderson roared. The entire precinct went dead silent. Phones stopped ringing. Officers stopped typing. Everyone stared at the captain, who was now standing frantically in front of Maya, his hands hovering over the handcuffs. "Ma'am," Captain Henderson stammered, his voice laced with absolute panic. "Dr. Caldwell, I am so profoundly sorry." "Officer, give me the keys. Give me the damn keys right now." Callahan was bewildered. "Captain," she was loitering. Henderson turned on Callahan with a ferocity that made the veteran officer shrink. "Are you out of your mind? Are you completely, irredeemably stupid?" "Callahan." Henderson grabbed the keys from Callahan's belt himself, his hands shaking as he unlocked the cuffs from Maya's wrists. Maya rubbed her bruised skin, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on the captain. "You idiot!" Henderson hissed at Callahan, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Do you have any idea who you just assaulted? Do you know who you just illegally arrested?" Callahan swallowed hard, finally realizing that he had crossed a line he couldn't see. "She's just some woman." "She," Captain Henderson said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror, "is Dr. Maya Caldwell. She is the newly appointed lead investigator for the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. She was literally sent here from Washington, D.C., to lead the federal audit into this exact precinct for allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. She literally holds the keys to our federal funding, our jobs, and our freedom." Callahan's jaw dropped. The smug arrogance melted off his face, replaced by a pallid, sickening horror. He looked at Maya, who was no longer just a mother on a sidewalk. She was the Reaper, and she was looking right at him. Maya massaged her right wrist, looked Callahan dead in the eye, and finally spoke. "I told you," Maya said, her voice echoing in the quiet precinct. "You were going to regret this." The silence in the 4th Precinct was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion, where the dust hasn't yet settled, but the sheer magnitude of the destruction is fully understood by everyone present. Officer Derek Callahan looked as though the floor had vanished beneath him. His face, previously flushed with the exertion of his own arrogance, was now the color of wet ash. He stared at Dr. Maya Caldwell, his brain frantically trying to rewind the last 45 minutes, searching for an undo button that simply did not exist. Captain Henderson was practically hyperventilating. He backed away from Maya as if she were made of radioactive material. "Dr. Caldwell, I cannot apologize enough. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding. If you'll just step into my office, we can get you some water, make a few calls, and completely expunge this from the system." It never happened. Maya did not move toward his office. She remained standing exactly where she was, rubbing the angry red indents on her wrists where the steel had bitten into her skin. Her posture was flawless. "Captain Henderson," Maya began, her voice crisp, devoid of any shouting but carrying the weight of a judge rendering a verdict. "Do not patronize me by calling this a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is writing down the wrong address on a dispatch ticket. What your officer did today was a targeted, textbook execution of racial profiling, followed by false imprisonment, aggravated assault, and battery under the color of law." Sergeant Miller, still sitting behind the booking desk, swallowed loudly. The sound echoed in the room. "Furthermore," Maya continued, turning her gaze to the terrified rookie, "Hendricks, I am issuing a verbal, on-the-record directive as a representative of the Department of Justice. As of this exact second, all body camera footage, dash camera footage, and dispatch audio from Officer Callahan's vehicle, Cruiser 412, is to be immediately sequestered and backed up to a secure federal server. If a single frame of video or a single second of audio goes missing, I will personally see to it that you are indicted for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice." "Done. It's done," Henderson stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the booking sergeant. "Miller, secure the drives. Now." "Yes, Captain," Miller said, his fingers flying across his keyboard with desperate speed. Just then, the glass doors of the precinct flew open. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in dark green surgical scrubs strode into the room, his face a mask of absolute fury. Clinging tightly to his left hand was 8-year-old Jackson, his face stained with tears, still clutching a broken piece of his robotic arm. Maya, Dr. David Caldwell, a prominent pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at the city's top hospital, and Maya's older brother, boomed across the lobby. "Mommy." Jackson broke away from his uncle and sprinted across the tiled floor, throwing his arms around Maya's waist, burying his face into her trench coat. Maya let out a ragged breath, the iron-clad professional exterior cracking just enough to let the mother through. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around her son, kissing the top of his head. "I'm right here, sweetie. I'm right here. I'm safe. Everything is going to be okay." David walked up to the group, his eyes sweeping over the officers before landing on the red welts on his sister's wrists. His jaw clenched so tight the muscle fluttered visibly. "Who did this?" David demanded. His voice was low, rich, and dangerously calm. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. Captain Henderson stepped forward, raising his hands defensively. "Dr. Caldwell, please." "I asked a question," David interrupted, his eyes locking onto Callahan, who was visibly trying to shrink behind the captain. You put hands on my sister in front of her child. Callahan opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at David's surgical scrubs, the embroidered hospital logo, the undeniable aura of success and authority, and realized that his initial assessment of Maya, a poor, single mother from the wrong side of the tracks with a beat-up car, was a fatal miscalculation. Maya drove that 10-year-old Honda not because she had to, but because she was a frugal woman saving for her son's college fund. Despite earning a federal executive's salary, Maya stood up, holding Jackson's hand tightly. She looked at Captain Henderson. "Captain, I want an EMT dispatched to this precinct immediately to photograph and document my injuries," Maya stated. "And then, I want the badges and service weapons of both these officers placed on your desk. They are stripped of their police powers, pending a full federal investigation. If they are allowed to leave this building with their firearms, I will have the FBI swarm this precinct before sunset." "You can't do that," Callahan finally snapped, his survival instinct briefly overriding his terror. "You're a DOJ lawyer, not my chief. I have union representation. I have rights." Maya tilted her head, a cold smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You are absolutely correct. Officer Callahan, you have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start exercising it." Captain Henderson didn't hesitate. The survival of his entire precinct and his own pension was on the line. He turned to Callahan and held out his hand. "Give me your gun and your badge." "Derek," Henderson ordered, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Now." "Cap, come on. She didn't identify herself. She refused a lawful order," Callahan pleaded, unbuckling his duty belt with shaking hands. "There was no lawful order," Maya countered smoothly. "As your dashcam audio will undoubtedly prove, you failed to articulate any reasonable suspicion of a crime. You acted on bias, and when your ego was challenged, you escalated to violence. You dug this grave. Callahan, get comfortable in it." Callahan slammed his badge and Glock onto the booking desk. Hendricks, silent and pale, wordlessly unclipped his own belt and laid it next to his training officers. "Take my son home, David," Maya said quietly to her brother. "I have a few hours of paperwork to do here, and then I have a phone call to make to Washington." As David led a still sniffling Jackson out the door, Maya turned her attention back to the precinct captain. The audit wasn't just starting. It had just been handed a smoking gun. News of the incident didn't leak. It exploded. By Thursday morning, the story of a Department of Justice civil rights investigator being violently arrested for standing on a sidewalk had made national headlines. But Maya was not interested in a media circus. She was interested in systemic eradication. She set up her DOJ command center in a conference room downtown, completely bypassing the local police headquarters to avoid contamination of evidence. Her team of federal agents and forensic data analysts descended upon the 4th Precinct's digital records like a swarm of locusts. Officer Derek Callahan was suspended without pay, barricaded inside his home while news vans parked on his lawn. The police union initially attempted to rally behind him, releasing a boilerplate statement about officer safety and non-compliant suspects. But the statement was hastily retracted when Maya's office released the unedited dashcam footage to the public. The video clearly showed Maya standing peacefully with her coffee, followed by Callahan's aggressive, unprovoked assault, all while young Jackson watched in horror. But Maya knew this wasn't just about one bad apple. A man like Callahan didn't operate in a vacuum. He operated in an ecosystem that protected, encouraged, and rewarded his behavior. She needed to prove the pattern. The breakthrough came late Friday night. Maya was sitting in the DOJ conference room, rubbing her temples, surrounded by towering stacks of dispatch logs. The door opened, and a junior federal agent stepped in. "Dr. Caldwell," the agent said. "We have a walk-in. It's the rookie, Officer Toby Hendricks. He says he wants to talk, and he brought his own lawyer. He's asking for federal immunity." Maya's eyes hardened. "Bring him in." Hendricks looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He sat across from Maya, his lawyer placing a thick manila folder on the glass table. "Dr. Caldwell," Hendricks began, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to apologize. I should have stopped him. I should have put my hands on him. Not you. I was terrified of him. He ruins rookies who don't play his game." "Apologies don't change the past, Mr. Hendricks," Maya replied neutrally. "What do you have to offer me that prevents me from naming you as a co-conspirator in a federal civil rights lawsuit?" Hendricks nodded to his lawyer, who opened the folder. Inside were dozens of printed screenshots from an encrypted messaging app, alongside bank deposit slips. "Callahan wasn't just patrolling Oak Ridge Heights," Hendricks explained, his hands shaking as he pushed the documents across the table. "He was being paid under the table by the Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association, specifically by the HOA president, Brenda Carmichael." Maya stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. She remembered the woman on the porch, the one who had cheered while Callahan wrenched her arm behind her back. "Explain," Maya commanded, leaning forward. "Oak Ridge is a public neighborhood, but the residents treat it like a gated community." Hendricks continued, the words spilling out of him like a confession. "Brenda Carmichael set up a beautification fund, but the money was actually a slush fund used to pay off certain officers at the 4th Precinct, Callahan being the ringleader. Their job was to aggressively harass, intimidate, and push out anyone who didn't belong. Construction workers, delivery drivers, teenagers walking through, and minorities." Maya flipped through the screenshots. The messages were vile. Brenda Carmichael was explicitly sending Callahan photos of people she deemed suspicious, almost exclusively black and brown individuals, with messages like, "Got another stray on Elm Street. Earn your bonus. Derek." "Callahan targeted you because Brenda sent him a text about your car," Hendricks revealed, pointing to a specific printout. Maya looked at the timestamp. It was exactly 5 minutes before Callahan pulled his cruiser up to the curb. Brenda Carmichael had seen Maya waiting for her son, deemed her a threat to the neighborhood's aesthetic, and unleashed her paid attack dog. "How far up does this go?" Maya asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Captain Henderson knew," Hendricks said, swallowing hard. "He didn't take the money, but he looked the other way, because the HOA donated heavily to the Police Benevolent Fund. Callahan kept a ledger of the payouts. He kept it in his locker. I copied it before I walked out of the precinct on Tuesday." Maya looked at the young rookie. He had been a coward on the sidewalk, but he had just handed her the keys to dismantling a massive corruption ring. "Agent Reed," Maya called out to the agent standing by the door. "Draft federal arrest warrants. I want Officer Derek Callahan, Captain Greg Henderson, and Brenda Carmichael in federal custody by dawn. Charges will include conspiracy against rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, bribery, and wire fraud." "Yes, ma'am," Agent Reed said, a fierce smile on his face as he left the room. Maya stood up, gathering the files. The pain in her wrist flared up, a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of the humiliation she had endured in front of her child. But as she looked at the mountain of evidence, the ache was replaced by a profound, righteous fire. They had thought she was an easy target, a nobody. Tomorrow morning, they would wake up to the full, devastating weight of the United States government crashing down upon their front doors. And Maya was going to be the one holding the sledgehammer. At 5:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, the affluent, perfectly manicured neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights was cloaked in a quiet, pre-dawn fog. The sprinklers hummed their rhythmic, wealthy tune over the imported Bermuda grass. Inside her sprawling, 6-bedroom colonial estate, Brenda Carmichael was already awake. She sat at her expansive marble kitchen island, wrapped in a plush silk robe, sipping a freshly brewed macchiato. She was scrolling through the private neighborhood watch app, drafting a lengthy, vitriolic post about the disgraceful media coverage of Officer Callahan's suspension, wholly convinced that her wealth and status insulated her from any real-world consequences. She was typing the word injustice when her heavy mahogany front door practically exploded off its hinges. The sound was like a bomb going off in the quiet suburb. Brenda screamed, dropping her phone, the hot espresso shattering across the pristine marble floor. "FBI federal agents, search warrant, keep your hands where we can see them." A dozen heavily armed FBI agents in tactical gear poured into the foyer, their boots tracking mud across the expensive Persian rugs. The beams of their tactical flashlights sliced through the dim morning light, sweeping the house. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, a formidable woman with cold, uncompromising eyes, strode through the wreckage of the front door, her badge displayed prominently on her tactical vest. "What is the meaning of this?" Brenda shrieked, clutching her silk robe tightly around her neck, her face pale with shock. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am the president of the HOA. My husband is a senior partner at Harrison and Webb. I will have all of your badges for this." Agent Jenkins didn't slow her pace. She walked right up to the kitchen island, pulled a heavy stack of papers from her vest, and slammed the federal warrant down onto the marble counter, right over the spilled espresso. "Brenda Carmichael, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, bribery of a public official, and federal wire fraud," Agent Jenkins recited, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "You are insane," Brenda spat, stepping backward. "I haven't done anything. You're ruining my floor." Jenkins nodded to two agents who stepped forward, grabbing Brenda by the arms. The sheer, terrifying reality of the situation finally pierced Brenda's bubble of entitlement. As the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted around her wrists, exactly the same way they had bitten into Maya Caldwell's skin just days prior, Brenda began to hyperventilate. They marched her out the front door. The flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen black federal SUVs bathed the neighborhood in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Neighbors, the same neighbors who had blindly followed Brenda's prejudiced directives, were now standing on their porches in their pajamas, watching in stunned silence as the neighborhood's self-appointed queen was stuffed into the back of an armored vehicle. Simultaneously, across town, in a heavily fortified middle-class suburb, Officer Derek Callahan was experiencing his own personal nightmare. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He was sitting on his couch in the dark, surrounded by empty beer cans, his service weapon confiscated, his mind racing through paranoid scenarios. When the rhythmic, deafening pounding came at his door, he didn't even try to run. He knew what it was. "FBI, open the door." Callahan stood up on shaky legs. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. He expected to see a local SWAT team, guys he maybe knew from the academy. Instead, he was met with the grim, unsmiling faces of the federal government. "Hey, guys. Look, "I'm on the job," Callahan tried to say, his voice cracking, raising his hands in a pathetic attempt to invoke the thin blue line brotherhood. "We're all law enforcement here. Let's just talk about this." The lead agent, a towering man named Agent Reed, grabbed Callahan by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed him face first into his own living room wall. "You stopped being law enforcement the second you took a bribe to hunt citizens like animals." Agent Reed growled directly into Callahan's ear. "Hands behind your back. Derek, you're going to a federal holding facility. They love dirty cops in there." Callahan began to weep. The tough, aggressive bully who took pleasure in tormenting a single mother on a sidewalk was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified man sobbing as the cuffs clicked shut. The most dramatic arrest, however, was saved for Captain Greg Henderson. Maya Caldwell wanted to send a message that would echo through every precinct in the state. At 6 a.m., right during the shift change at the 4th precinct, when the building was packed with both outgoing night shift officers and incoming day shift officers, a convoy of federal vehicles surrounded the building. Agent Reed, accompanied by Maya Caldwell, who was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit, her injured wrist wrapped in a medical brace, walked through the front doors. The entire precinct fell dead silent. Captain Henderson came out of his office, his face draining of blood when he saw Maya. "Captain Henderson," Maya said, her voice carrying across the entire booking area, ensuring every single officer heard her. "Your precinct is hereby under federal receivership. Agent Reed, execute the warrant." In front of 60 of his own officers, the man who had allowed a culture of violent, racist corruption to fester in his house was stripped of his badge, handcuffed, and perp-walked out of his own precinct. The message was unmistakable. The era of untouchable badges was over. But the real twist was yet to come. During the interrogation phase, Brenda Carmichael, desperate to save herself from a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison, immediately folded. She turned state's evidence before her high-priced lawyers could even unbuckle their briefcases. It wasn't just about the neighborhood aesthetic, Brenda confessed, sitting in a cold metal chair in an FBI interrogation room, mascara running down her tear-stained face. It was real estate. Maya, watching behind the two-way mirror, leaned in. Brenda revealed that she and a local real estate developer named Richard Sterling, the mayor's own brother, had concocted the scheme. By using Callahan and other paid-off officers to brutally harass minorities and lower-income families who passed through or lived near Oak Ridge Heights, they manufactured a false crime wave and an atmosphere of hostility. When targeted families inevitably decided to move to escape the police harassment, Sterling's LLCs would swoop in and buy the properties at drastically reduced, undervalued prices, only to flip them to wealthy, approved buyers for massive profits. Callahan wasn't just a racist cop. He was a blunt instrument for a multi-million-dollar federal racketeering enterprise. Maya smiled, a predatory, victorious gleam in her eyes. The net had just gotten exponentially larger. She wasn't just taking down a dirty cop and a racist HOA president anymore. She was taking down the mayor's office. The United States District Courthouse was a fortress of imposing mahogany and cold marble, buzzing with a frenetic, nervous energy that had consumed the entire city for weeks. The media spectacle was completely unprecedented. Local and national news vans choked the streets outside, and the courtroom gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder every single morning. Maya Caldwell, despite being the architect of this massive federal reckoning, had officially recused herself from the DOJ prosecution team to avoid any technical conflicts of interest. Instead, She sat in the very front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecutor's table. She wore immaculate, tailored charcoal suits, her posture rigid, her expression utterly unreadable. She was a silent, looming, daily reminder of the catastrophic mistake the defendants had made. Across the aisle sat the disgraced former officer Derek Callahan, looking hollowed out, his skin sallow and aged, and Brenda Carmichael, who had traded her designer silk robes for drab, conservative court attire, though the muted clothing did absolutely nothing to hide her violently trembling hands. The federal prosecution's case was a meticulously orchestrated demolition of the defendants' lives. The star witness was none other than former rookie officer Toby Hendricks, having secured full federal immunity in exchange for his complete cooperation. Toby took the stand on the third day of the trial. He looked exhausted, the weight of his own guilt and cowardice still heavy on his shoulders, but his voice was steady as he spoke into the microphone. "He told me she didn't belong," Toby testified, his eyes scanning the incredibly diverse jury box. "Officer Callahan explicitly stated we were hunting for people who didn't fit the Oak Ridge Heights profile. When I asked him what crime she was actually committing on that sidewalk, he told me to shut up. He said, and I quote, 'I make the rules here.'" The lead prosecuting attorney, a razor-sharp federal litigator named Robert Klein, paced slowly before the jury. "And did you witness Officer Callahan receive compensation for these targeted harassment campaigns?" "Yes, sir," Toby replied. His gaze dropped momentarily before snapping back up to look directly at Brenda Carmichael. "I saw the physical ledger Callahan kept in his locker, and I saw the printed encrypted messages from Mrs. Carmichael. She would send photos of black and brown individuals walking down the public street, calling them strays and telling Derek to earn his bonus. It was a highly coordinated, paid sweep to keep the neighborhood exclusively white and wealthy, and to drive down property values for the mayor's brother to swoop in and buy." Loud gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. Brenda sank lower into her heavy wooden chair, her face flushed with a sickening, panicked red. But the absolute most devastating moment of the entire trial came when Klein introduced Exhibit A, the unedited dashcam and bodycam footage of the arrest. The massive digital screens in the courtroom flickered to life. The audio was crystal clear. The jury watched Maya, calm and impeccably articulate, exercising her constitutional rights while holding a cup of coffee. They watched Callahan's fragile ego fracture in real time. And then they watched the sudden, unprovoked violence. The physical assault on the screen was brutal to witness, but it was the audio that completely broke the courtroom. When 8-year-old Jackson's terrified, heartbroken voice pierced the courtroom speakers, "Mom, Mum," followed by the sharp, tragic sound of his school robotic project shattering on the concrete pavement. 2 jurors openly wept. The jury foreman, a stoic older veteran, glared at Callahan with such intense, unfiltered disgust that the former officer had to physically look away, staring down at his lap. Maya sat perfectly still in the gallery, her jaw clenched tight. She was reliving the worst trauma of her life, but she refused to look away from the screens. She wanted everyone in that room to feel every single ounce of her son's terror. The defense attorneys, charging upwards of $1,000 an hour, tried desperately to stem the massive bleeding. They tried to paint Toby Hendricks as a habitual liar, trying to save his own skin. They tried to argue that Brenda Carmichael's horrific text messages were taken out of context and were merely the overly zealous concerns of an overly protective neighborhood watch president. But the paper trail was absolute. It was a titanium web of illegal bank transfers, shady real estate deeds, and encrypted text logs that the FBI had easily decrypted. The jury saw right through the high-priced smoke and mirrors. After a grueling 3-week trial, deliberations took exactly 3 hours and 42 minutes. When the jury returned to the box, the silence in the massive room was deafening. Judge Leo Pendleton, a man who possessed a legendary zero-tolerance policy for public corruption and civil rights abuses, stared down from the high bench with barely concealed wrath. On the charge of conspiracy to deprive civil rights, we find the defendant, Derek Callahan, guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault under the color of law, guilty. On the charge of federal bribery, guilty. Callahan didn't even react. He just stared blankly ahead, his life entirely over. On the charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy against civil rights, we find the defendant, Brenda Carmichael, guilty. Brenda let out a piercing, theatrical wail of absolute despair before collapsing heavily against her defense attorney's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. Sentencing took place a month later, and Judge Pendleton brought down the hammer of God. You were entrusted with the sacred power of the state, Mr. Callahan. Judge Pendleton boomed, his voice vibrating through the heavy floorboards of the court. You weaponized a badge to terrorize a mother and child for a few extra dollars and the stroke of your own malignant ego. You are a profound disgrace to law enforcement. I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Callahan visibly flinched as the heavy wooden gavel cracked. Judge Pendleton then turned his dark, furious gaze upon Brenda. Mrs. Carmichael, you weaponized your immense wealth and your deep-seated prejudice. Therefore, under federal RICO statutes, your sprawling Oak Ridge Heights estate, your frozen bank accounts, and your luxury vehicles are hereby permanently seized by the United States government, deemed the illegal proceeds of a criminal enterprise. Furthermore, you are sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. She had spent her entire adult life viciously judging others for not belonging in her exclusive, wealthy enclave. Now, she was entirely stripped of every dime she had, destined to spend the next decade in a 6x8 concrete cell wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit. The dominoes continued to fall over the next few weeks. Captain Henderson, who had cowardly taken a plea deal early on to avoid a public trial, was serving a 5-year sentence and was permanently stripped of his government pension, leaving him bankrupt. Mayor Sterling and his brother Richard were indicted by the DOJ a week later, completely dismantling the city's corrupt political machine overnight, as the heavily armed federal marshals moved in to handcuff Callahan and Carmichael to transport them to federal lockup. Maya Caldwell finally stood up from her seat in the front row. Callahan paused in the center aisle, looking at her one last time. There was no defiance left in his eyes, no arrogant smirk, only the crushing, suffocating weight of utter defeat. "I told you," Maya said softly, her perfectly calm voice carrying just far enough through the quiet courtroom for him to hear. "I told you to consult your supervisor before doing something you'd regret. Have a good life. Derek." 6 months later, the neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights looked radically different. The heavily biased HOA board had been dissolved under a federal consent decree, replaced by an independent, state-appointed oversight committee. The 4th precinct had been entirely overhauled, wiped clean of its toxic elements. Maya was sitting on the exact same wrought-iron bench on the public sidewalk outside the Oak Ridge Preparatory Academy. The autumn air was crisp, smelling of pine and fallen leaves. She was holding a fresh cup of coffee. No police cruisers slowed down to illegally question her. No wealthy, entitled neighbors glared from their expensive porches. At 3:30 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the academy swung open. Jackson came running down the sidewalk, his little green blazer flapping in the wind. He wasn't crying this time. He was beaming from ear to ear, holding up a brand new, perfectly functioning robotic arm that was twice as complex as the one that had broken months ago. "Mom, look!" Jackson shouted, his eyes wide with pure joy. "I got it to grip perfectly. It actually works." Maya smiled, a radiant, fierce expression of pure maternal triumph. She stood up and wrapped her arms tightly around her brilliant son. The corrupt system had tried its absolute hardest to break them, but it had entirely underestimated the ferocious, unstoppable power of a mother defending her child's rights. Karma had not just knocked on the door, it had kicked it completely off the hinges, and justice had finally, permanently, been served. What an absolutely incredible story of righteous karma. It's a terrifying reality that people like Officer Callahan and Brenda Carmichael exist individuals who abuse power and privilege to bully others just because they think they can get away with it. But it is deeply satisfying to watch a corrupt, racist system completely shatter when it mistakenly targets the absolute worst possible person. Doctor. Maya Caldwell didn't just defend herself. She dismantled an entire racketeering ring, protected her son, and sent a powerful message that nobody is above the law, not a bad cop, not an entitled HOA president, and not a corrupt politician. Justice served cold, served federal. If you loved this story of instant karma and justice hitting back hard, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a satisfying revenge story today, and subscribe to our channel for more crazy, dramatic, real-life stories where the bad guys get exactly what they deserve. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Maya's shoes? See you in the next one.